Today we will start, following our discussion of the Qin Dynasty last week, today we will start with the Han Dynasty. Roughly 206 BCE to 220 CE. Again, I would never require you, nor does the College Board require you to remember those exact years. But if you can remember about 400 years, round about the first millennium, the turn of the first millennium, you're good to go. About 200 years before the Common Era, about 200 years after the Common Era. The Han Dynasty will continue the centralized administration of the previous Qin Dynasty. But they're going to reduce the harsh rule and the brutality of the Qin legalist system. And we mentioned last week, legalism was the name of the game for the Qin Dynasty, where the government would be ruled based on a harsh set of laws that were strictly enforced, essentially ruling the state by terror.
So you ease the strict.
It will ease those restrictions as time goes on, and rather than running a legalist system, will begin to adopt Confucianist ideals, or Confucius ideals. Yes, ma'am?
Would you say that the leader of the Qin was his name again?
Qin Shi Huangdi.
Qin Shi Huangdi was more of a dictator?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, yeah, he's a totalitarian leader. He's a king. He's an emperor. He's all of these are words for basically the same thing. Okay, but yes, he's absolutely rules with an iron fist dictator. Now that said, the Han emperors, who might be a little bit more benevolent because Confucius talks about being a good person and being a good ruler, and that according to the 5 relationships, the ruler has obligations to the ruled, just as the people that are being ruled have obligations to the ruler. Even so, that individual, is that Han emperor putting himself up for elections? No, no. So he's still dictating how the emperor runs. So we have in our mind that a dictator rules by iron, with an iron fist and with absolute authority. They always have absolute authority, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be harsh and repressive, even though a lot of dictators are, because how do you often throughout world history take control of a state?
Crush people.
By being harsh and repressive, by winning wars, by crushing your enemies down. All right? So we'll talk about that a lot this year, and maybe we'll, at the end of the year, be able to reflect on, were there benevolent dictators, good leaders, even though they still didn't offer their people any political liberty. We will see. So the Han Dynasty is going to continue the centralization of the Qin, but it's going to be like a softer, kinder centralization as they adopt Confucian ideology. We can see on the map here that the Han Dynasty is going to push far further than the Qin Dynasty would, further to the west, further to the south, and into the Korean peninsula as well. So the Qin Dynasty is going to be relatively small compared to the extent that the Han Dynasty will eventually push. What does that tell us about the rule of the Han versus the rule of the Qin? Well, the Han facilitated itself in such a way where it allowed it to bring in more territory. It also existed for 400 years rather than the 20 years of the Qin Dynasty. So it's a lot more time for growth and expansion. Yes, ma'am?
What's the point of the Great Wall of China if they go beyond it?
Yeah, good question. So the original Great Wall of China that the Qin built was, of course, at the outer frontier of the Qin Dynasty. But as the Han Dynasty pushes further, they said, having this territory up here is more valuable than not having it. So they push forward. But what problem do you think the Han Dynasty will eventually fall into, stretching beyond this original Great Wall? Outside nomadic tribes, causing them problems. Talk about people called the Xiongnu people. Yes?
As the Han Dynasty is expanding, are they conquering other people that used to live on the land?
Yeah. That's what empires do.
It makes it seem so simple that it's just expanding, but I feel like it's more...
Yeah, okay, so... Yeah, if we were to delve deep into the weeds here, every bit of expansion is other groups of people coming under Han domination. Some might go more peacefully and say, okay, fine, I'll start paying taxes to another person, no big deal. Others might put up a little fight and have to ultimately to be defeated. But yes, this expansion is not happening with Han officials walking around handing flowers to everybody. There are armies at the frontier, and they are what are driving the expansion. And then also, and I'm sure Tyler could talk to you about this at lunch if he wanted to, but the people that they're coming into contact, and often times, don't want to be dominated by foreigners. And they are going to fight to keep them out. So yes, this is world history and the expansion of empires, and that is a bloody mess. I think there's a misconception that conquering in world history and domination of one people by another didn't start until the Europeans started doing it in the 15 and 1600s. That is absolutely not the case. Violence, expansion, warfare has been ever present in all corners of the globe. Okay? Europeans did not invent it. Europeans mastered it. They were able to dominate the globe like no other people had ever been able to do, but they didn't invent it. All right? This comes up in maybe you're talking about it in your history class, or you did last year in your AP US history class, or my kids are studying Native Americans in 5th grade. And a common misconception that people have is that Native American groups, and we'll talk about this year, Native American groups were peaceful and harmonious prior to Europeans arriving and teaching them like the wicked ways of the world. And that's absolutely not the case. Every Native American group had his tribal boundaries. And it might not be like political boundaries as we would see them in a map, but they absolutely knew where their hunting grounds were, and they actually absolutely knew who their neighbors and who their friends and who their enemies were. And there was a lot of conflict, and we'll talk about that this year. So good question. Anything else? Any other question before we press? Sweet. So with regard to the Han Dynasty, they're going to continue the centralization of the previous Qin, although they're going to replace the harsh and repressive rule of the legalist system with a Confucian ideal. For most of the 400 years of the Han Dynasty, there was relative peace and prosperity. And how do you know there was relative peace and prosperity? Because it's around for 400 years. When there's a lot of chaos, and when there's a lot of poverty, empires typically don't last. So we can often tell in world history the general success of an empire in its duration and how long it's going to last, right? So relative internal peace. Now, we don't speak in absolutes in world history. Does that mean there's never any protests and uprisings and frustrated people? Absolutely not. But the Han Dynasty was able to suppress most of that. Yes, ma'am? Qin Shi Huangdi died, right? Qin Shi Huangdi dies.
That's the main reason why it fell.
And that's the one issue. When you have a harsh and repressive rule that is so strongly connected to that leader, there is no guarantee that your children are going to be as dynamic or as able to rule as you were. So once you die, good luck with it. Whereas the Han Dynasty, though it is going to be one family dynastic rule for those 400 years, they are basing their rule on Confucian ideals, which really sets it beyond the individual, right? It's giving a script, a set of ideals that any leader can look at and follow as to how to be a good ruler. So that might give us some reason why they're going to last so much longer than the Qin. A couple other things to mention under the Han Dynasty. In addition to continuing a lot of the traditions and centralization that the Qin Dynasty had started. We remember the Qin Dynasty centralized by doing a number of things. Creating a link between north and south, right? Starting to dig some canals. We'll talk more about that as time goes on. Creating a unified sets of weights and measures. A call for a national census to organize tax collection and labor services, right? And military numbers. Also, creating a unified script of that Mandarin Chinese language. All of these things centralize a state. The Han Dynasty continued those. They didn't start over from scratch, they just continued. But the Han Dynasty would do some other things that would not only link their own empire with each other, but also push its empire with connections to other parts of the world. And here's where the first mention, and we're going to talk about this a lot through the year, the establishment of what's known as the Silk Road. a connection. It's not one road ultimately, but it's a network of trails and trading routes, overland trade routes, okay, going from eastern China all the way into South Asia, but ultimately pushing all the way through the Persian Empire and into the Mediterranean region and into the Roman Empire. So the Silk Road is going to be a connection within the Han Dynasty itself, but also connecting Han China to other civilizations. We already said 3 M's of cultural diffusion, 3 M's of syncretism, 3 M's of culture and ideas and technology moving from one portion of the globe to another. The 3 M's are, yes, military action, like actually fighting. Miss Mixon in the back. Merchants. These are the traders who are doing the primary action on the Silk Road. Very good. And Abby? Missionaries. Very good. Those guys that are expressly going out to spread their religious ideas. So between missionary activity, military action, and merchant activity, culture and ideas spread. So here we have an example of China coming in contact with Indian empires, and China coming in contact with Persia, and China coming in contact with the Mediterranean world. All right? And when those contacts are made, ideas go both ways. Yes, Nia? Yeah.
So it's not. So would you say that like Confucianism didn't really like spread to other countries?
Confucianism won't. Confucianism won't. But some of the technologies and developments will. I have another hand over here. Yes, ma'am.
I was like, where did it exactly start with Silk Road actually start?
Just in eastern China and the main cities of eastern China, which I'm not requiring you right now to memorize. So just think Silk Road, East Asia, all the way to the Mediterranean. All right? And please note, this is a long way. Okay, 2 things to bring up about world history. One, I just said the Han Dynasty spanned 400 years of history. We're going to talk about it in about 10 minutes. All right? That distorts what we think 400 years is. So even though we talk about the Han Dynasty being here and being gone in 400 years, we want to acknowledge, and I like to do it by just thinking of where we are now and looking at 400 years ago from now, we get to 1615. That's a lot of time, okay? So there is, we need to make sure we are cognizant of how long of a time span this is. That predates the United States by 150 years, right? So that, and we also want to remember that today you can hop on a plane and fly from Detroit to China and be there well within the day. Then, this is a journey of months, right? And it's probably not one individual that's going the whole way. There's a guy who's going to take some stuff to one point, and he trades with another trader who's going to go another chunk of the distance, and another trader. So this is not a quick and easy route. A couple things to mention before we head off to lunch. Obviously, the Han Dynasty is going to have an emphasis on Confucian teachings. And how do you emphasize Confucian teachings? You teach, here's Confucius. They did not do much eyebrow taming in early China here. How do you emphasize Confucian teachings? You organize it by the government, and the government would set up an elaborate examination system. Literally, just like you guys had to take a test to be in this program, to become a part of the bureaucracy in China, and that is a word we need to know, bureaucracy, government officials that carry out the orders of the empire. To become a part of the bureaucracy in China, you gotta pass a test. And this test is not easy. It requires a memorization, an absolute memorization of the classics of Chinese thinking, including, but not limited to, Confucius and his Analects. To where you absolutely had to know it word for word and page by page. And your question could ask you, what is the third line of whatever page of the Analects? And you had to spit that back. It is strict rote memorization. Because China, in this day and age, was not encouraging free thinking. They were encouraging follow the book. So you raise and you train your bureaucrats to become experts on the books. And then they are now qualified to go and carry out the orders of the central dynasty. This is hugely important because under the Confucian system and under the Han examination system, anybody could pass the test. It didn't matter who your daddy was. And give me 1 second, we're going to go to lunch in just a moment. It doesn't matter who your daddy is, all right? Anybody with the skill and the ability to pass the test could pass the test. So it would create, just give me 1 moment, it would create a class in China known as the scholar gentry. The scholar gentry. A leadership class in China based on intellectual ability and nothing else. Now, truth be told, how does one pass the test? How do you think they pass? How do you think you could pass a test like this? Study, 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 study. What are you not doing while you're doing so much studying?
Working.
You're probably not working very much. So what kind of young people would be more likely to be able to do all the studying that would allow them to enter the scholar gentry? Probably the children of the wealthy who are having other people do the work for them. So you don't have to be wealthy, and certainly there are examples of meager people, regular people, that could rise to the level of the scholar gentry and do very well because of their intellectual gifts. But the majority of people that enter the bureaucracy, they're coming from the aristocracy, the upper class. One question, then you got to go to lunch.
I'm just going to point out that this actually was it works very well in testifying that Vietnam was under the rule of China until 938. That's about 1,000 years. So adopting that into the provinces around China, that gave the Vietnamese people, like the scholar gentry as well,
a chance to be a part of it.
That's how Vietnam was stayed, because the Vietnamese people, they ruled over the Vietnamese people, but then they're still under the Chinese government, the Han. But with that in place, they are now more loyal to the Han, since they have to learn root by root. And that's how, up to this day, it's not a stereotype kind of thing, but up to this day, why Asian countries, especially Southeast Asian countries, they learn a lot.
The value of education.
That thing.
Beautiful.
Gentry.
Thank you so much. Go eat.